The government has set out its long-awaited strategy to help the UK reach net zero emissions by 2050. Homeowners will be able to apply for grants of up to £5,000 to install low-carbon heat pumps to replace gas boilers. Well, would you be willing to take up the offer of a grant to buy a heat pump? To answer all your questions on heat pump and household-related matters, with me is Andrew Shepherd, Managing Director at Top Hat, who build zero-carbon homes and factories. And I'm also joined by Laura Bishop, Chair at the Ground Source Heat Pump Association. Thank you both so much for your time tonight. We've got lots and lots of questions here. And Andrew, if I can just start off with one from Alam Abdo, who says, who can claim this grant? He says only people on low income or all householders with gas boilers. Is there a sort of means test for the grant, or can anyone have it?
Well, so far, the answer is currently unclear. So all that we do know is that the grant will be available from April 2022. So there's a period of time where I'm sure we'll start to see more detail around the grant. What the government have said, and they have confirmed already, is that funding support will be targeted for those who need it most. But what we're talking about in terms of the total quantum of grants they're talking about is a maximum of 90,000 homes benefiting from the grant.
Which is a long way short of the total needed.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's 30 million houses in the year, so we're talking about 0.3% of the total housing population. What's also key to understand, though, is absolutely that air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps are not appropriate for every single house. We've got millions of houses in the UK that are under-insulated or have no insulation whatsoever. They are absolutely the place to start targeting money. Because air source heat pumps won't work in those houses without any insulation in the first place. OK,
and we should say that the heat pumps themselves can cost sort of up to £18,000 too, can't they? Laura, a question here from Ken Hiscox, who says heat pumps do seem to be quite large. Are their pumps small enough to fit into flats?
Yeah, so heat pumps come in all different shapes and sizes, from very small 2 or 3 kilowatt heat pumps all the way up to multi-megawatt commercial industrial heat pumps. There are certainly heat pumps on the market that are small enough to fit into small flats. There's shoebox units, which are very small indeed, and they are regularly going into social housing, high-rise blocks of flats, no problem at all. That's been happening for the last few years. One of the things that we do have to consider is the fact that there needs to be a domestic hot water cylinder. You can't generate domestic hot water instantaneously off a heat pump. So actually, it's sometimes the cylinder that's the biggest item rather than the heat pump itself. And some of the bigger heat pumps you might see for small houses actually contain the cylinder themselves, so they look bigger than they actually are. So that's one of the things to consider when you're looking at space.
And do you have to change, other aspects of your house too? How disruptive is it?
It very much depends on the house. As Andrew's just said, not every house is suitable for a heat pump, although many are. And we spend a lot of time dispelling myths around people believing that they have to have underfloor heating in their house, or they have to have all their radiators and pipework ripped out in the house, really pulled to bits in order to have a heat pump, and that's simply not true. From actual experience and from our members' experience, who are mainly ground and air source heat pump installers, what we find is that you might need to replace 2 or 3 radiators. It's certainly not a given that you have to have every single radiator replaced, but a good engineer and a good installer who's coming to your house will assess the existing emitters, they will assess the existing fabric, and they will then be able to advise on what radiators need to be replaced, if any.
OK, that's really helpful. Let me go back to you, Andrew. A question from Alan, who says, why does the government keep mentioning heat pumps as a substitute for replacing gas boilers? What about using direct replacement electric-powered boiler, which are 100% efficient?
Well, the issue, obviously, with burning gas is you're burning something. In the world we live in today, we typically warm our houses with coal, with logs, and with gas. And all of those create instant heat but also create carbon dioxide emissions. And what we're looking to do is reduce those. Our homes contribute a large amount of the carbon dioxide that the UK emits. So it's a real focus to move away from gas. One of the main options and one of the best options, and what we use as a business, are obviously air source heat pumps. And air source heat pumps are incredibly efficient. So we talk about efficiency, how much energy is produced. Now, an electric powered boiler obviously creates benefits from using 100% of the energy that it inputs. But air source heat pumps are even more efficient than that. So they create 4 times more energy and heat energy than they actually use electricity. So they're incredibly efficient, even more efficient than an electric power boiler. So that's one of the main reasons why the government is looking to drive the use of heat pumps.
OK, thank you for that. Laura, we've sort of touched on this, but a question from Michelle who says, how can people in upper level flats in cities install a heat pump when there is no outdoor space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's two answers to that. If you're living in social housing, high-rise blocks of flats, or even low-level communal blocks of flats, there are solutions called shared ground loops, which are happening now and have been happening for the last couple of years. I did touch on them previously, where we see a shared borehole system, a shared ground collector, which is collecting the energy out of the ground, and then each person in each flat has their own small ground source heat pump internally, which they're then using to extract heat out of the ground. That's fairly straightforward with social housing, where you've got maybe one housing association that owns an entire block, because they can look after everything from the boreholes to the heat pumps, and basically that they're almost telling the tenants that this is what you're going to have. If you're a private homeowner with a flat, that's slightly more difficult, because you have to encourage either your leasehold owner or your neighbours to come on board with you to have that kind of shared ground loop system. So if that's not feasible, and it is quite difficult if you're privately owning a flat, your option then is to have an air source heat pump, and that then comes down to whether you've got space on an outdoor wall. They can be mounted on the wall, and they don't have to sit on the floor or on a balcony. So those are your options there. Shared ground loop systems, very easy to do in social housing, not so easy in private housing, but air source is still an option if you live in a flat. OK, we'll try and get through some more of these questions. Got so many here.
Thank you for that. And for Andrew, Ian asks, can you use a heat pump to replace a warm air boiler?
Yeah, so a heat pump can either be wet or dry. So it can either be used to heat water or be used to heat air. The downside of just using a dry heat pump is that you then have a secondary system you'd need to use to heat hot water. So we would always advocate using a wet system that creates hot water that you use for your bath, for your shower, as well as for your heater.
Thank you. Laura, an interesting question from Tom. It says, how green will the transition be if we import heat pumps rather than manufacture our own?
Yeah, another good question. So yeah, at the moment, because there hasn't been the big demand that we want to see in the UK from heat pumps, we tend to import all of our heat pumps, or most of our heat pumps, from places like Asia and from Europe. What we are seeing now, because of the certainty that we're getting on heat pump rollout and heat pump industry in the UK, people like Valent, who are based just up the road from me in Belper, then looking to move air source heat pump manufacture to the UK, to their factory there. We've got companies like Kenza down in Cornwall who have been making their own heat pumps for many years, and I can only see that improving as we go forward with this strategy and we have more heat pump rollouts. So right now, yes, we're having to import them, but I see looking into the future that is going to change, and we're going to see more and more people building heat pumps in the UK.
OK. Andrew, Joseph asks, who can help monitor the major polluters on greenhouse gas emissions?
For me, I think it's really important we start to look at the source problems and the source areas, focusing on the key producers and production of CO2, particularly within the UK. So looking at things like carbon emitted from the creation of concrete and cement, huge production, 7 or 8% of the total UK carbon dioxide emissions from concrete. So starting to look at new intelligent materials, better products that really help to reduce demand. So I think it's really important that we start to focus on actually that source and where we're creating it through the manufacturing process in the UK.
OK. Laura, a question from Peter, who has quite a nice problem, I think. He says, we bought a 10 kilowatt heat pump this year for our swimming pool, and it works really well using 2 kilowatts of electricity. But it doesn't work well if the air temperature is low. But of course, we don't want to swim then. So my question is, how well will a heat pump work in midwinter in freezing conditions? Clearly, there won't be much heat content in the air.
Yes, yeah. So this is the difference between air source and ground source, where ground source is not affected by low air temperatures in the winter. It's stable all year round. But if you do have an air source heat pump, it is something that you must be aware of. When the temperature is cold outside, your COP or your efficiency would drop because the heat pump is having to work that much harder to raise the temperature from the cold outdoor air to the warm temperature that you need inside your house. So the important thing to look at is your seasonal efficiency, not just your instantaneous efficiency that's happening on the coldest day of the year, because those cold days may only be very few of the year, but in the spring and the autumn, your heat pump, your air source heat pump, will be working a lot more efficiently. So it's important to look at the seasonal efficiency, but with an air source, there is no getting away from the fact that their efficiency reduces in cold weather.
Just very quickly, though, it does still heat your house up properly when it's very cold. It's just that, yes, it's working
just less efficient.
Yes. Andrew, a question from Carol, who says, how do we get the financial help? Do they come round to check that our home is insulated enough?
Again, this is really unclear. As Laura mentioned, if you were to engage with one of her members, the engineer would most likely come around the house and give you some early initial advice on how to install and what the best process is. Do you need to change any of the radiators? It shouldn't be too difficult to switch from a traditional gas boiler to an air source heat pump. What we imagine is that they'll probably start to look at having approved installers who will come to your house, give you that recommendation, and that the payment will be made through that sort of process. It's what they've done in the past with things like the insulation and the Green Homes grants in the past.
OK, finally, Laura, as a question from Bob, who says, as wind and solar power generation isn't consistent or base power, what other alternatives do we have for coal and gas-powered power stations?
Okay, so two things. Obviously, we still have nuclear power in the UK. I heard somebody talking earlier today about how nuclear power actually generates about 17% of our base load electricity generation. So we may start to see more of the smaller nuclear reactors coming online. Of course, they have their own issues, but we do have that as an option. One of the things that is absolutely brilliant about heat pumps, particularly ground source, is the ability to store energy in the ground. So the ability to use a heat pump to switch on when there's too much electricity on the grid, there's too much wind, there's too much solar PV, a bit like switching on your electric vehicle, you switch your heat pump on to absorb that electrical power and help balance the grid. And conversely, when there's not enough power on the grid, if you've got thermal storage and or battery storage, you can actually allow your heat pump to switch off without damaging the thermal comfort of your building. So there's going to be a few different ways of managing that, and thermal storage and battery storage and electric heating systems is going to be a very interesting and important way to balance the national grid.
OK, Laura Bishop and Andrew Shepherd, thank you both very much indeed for racing through all those questions. Very good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.